So today I'm going to explore the question that you see on the slide right here about what feminist data science looks like. And I want to begin by acknowledging that a lot of the theoretical framework from this talk comes from the book Data Feminism, which I co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio, who you can see right here on the slide. And if you're curious about the book, it's actually available open access via the URL at the bottom of the slide, datafeminism.io. So what I'll do today is briefly summarize the book's theoretical framework and then move on to a set of recent examples of my own digital humanities work that attempts to put this framework into action. So just to jump right in, the motivating premise of our book is that in the world today, data is a tremendous form of power. So data-driven systems have been used quite infamously to decide, for example, which people who have been accused of a crime to send home on bail while they await trial, and then alternately, which people to keep in jail, thereby setting off a cascading chain of consequences that almost invariably impacts the rest of their lives. This was ProPublica's audit of the Compass, so-called pretrial flight risk assessment algorithm that got a lot of press a couple of years ago. Another example of work by Virginia Eubanks has shown how data-driven systems have been used to flag parents that are suspected of child abuse, also very often unfairly and with understandably devastating consequences. Closer to home on the academic front, there was that recent fiasco around the algorithm that was used to predict last year's A-level exam scores in the UK since the exams were canceled due to the pandemic. There's discriminatory hiring algorithms, resume screening algorithms. You know, I could go on, but the point is this: data is incredibly powerful, but that power is currently wielded unequally. And more specifically, it's wielded by a small group of well-resourced institutions located in the global north, with leadership consisting of mostly elite white men. So enter intersectional feminism. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip a longer primer on intersectional feminism, although I would direct you to the book if you want to read more about this. And what I'll say here is that intersectional feminism at its core is concerned with structures of power. So you could think of concepts like the Combahee River collectives, interlocking systems of oppression, Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins's formulation of the matrix of domination. Each of these scholars give us frameworks to structure critiques of power. So in order to explain or identify the reasons why certain groups experience oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other. So the basic argument that we make in the book is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, and I'm including digital humanities as a subset of data science, and we can talk about that later, intersectional feminism can help that unequal balance of power that it currently represents be challenged, rebalanced, and changed. And so we use the teachings of intersectional feminism along with other ideas from feminist activism and critical thought in order to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. And you can read them right here. But I'll say more generally, our goal with this was to operationalize feminism for data science. So to provide a clear set of principles for people who are currently working with data, for people who want to work with data, or for people who want to refuse to work with data on ideological grounds. And then in the book, we have one chapter devoted to each one of these principles where we talk about the feminist theory that underlies that particular principle, and then illustrate how it can be applied, and in fact has already been applied to data science through a lot of examples, and sometimes a joke. But in the rest of my talk today, as I mentioned, I'm going to present a set of examples from my own recent project as a way of showing what feminist data science can look like, and how more specifically, the kind of quantitative humanities work that I do can engage these 7 principles. And before moving forward, I just want to underscore the point, which applies to any kind of feminist data science, which is that it's possible to engage these principles at the same time as advancing active research questions in a particular field. So in other words, you don't need to choose between doing feminist data science and doing rigorous data science, or doing feminist data science and doing field defining work, or whatever. These are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, you can and should, in my opinion, be doing these things at the same time. So the first project I'm going to talk about actually has the most to do with the last principle in the book, which is about making labor visible. Although this project, like all feminist data science, also touches on issues of power. And that's because the project has to do with the internal dynamics of the abolitionist movement of the 19th century United States. So just a bit in the way of historical context. It's not an understatement to say that the abolitionist movement is one of the most important social movements in the nation's history and probably also in world history. This is primarily true because it led to the abolition of slavery in the United States. But it's also very interesting because how the end of slavery was accomplished was by a multiracial coalition of men and women at a time of otherwise fairly rigid social segregation in terms of both race and gender. And then, another interesting thing to note about the movement, which is in some ways a product of this diverse constituency, was that there was a huge amount of internal division. So, everyone was allied and in agreement about the need to end slavery, but they often sharply diverged about how to achieve that result, right? So do we burn it all down, or do we wait for gradual change? Do we move to the center in order to increase the numbers of supporters, or is there no room for moderation when human freedom is on the line? And in many ways, these debates about the abolition of slavery in the 19th century resemble a lot of contemporary debates, for example, about the abolition of the police today, or about movements towards racial justice more generally. Another thing that's really important for scholars is that many of these debates were captured in these abolitionist newspapers that you've been seeing here. And these functioned, in effect, as the social media of their day. So they were widely read and circulated and shared. All of the editors of all of the papers read each other's work. And also, because they predated our modern conception of copyright, newspapers very often reprinted contents from other newspapers, sometimes usually lightly edited, as a sign of endorsement. And then another important thing is obviously these newspapers have been digitized. And so what this means for scholars today is that there is in effect some very big textual data that documents this movement. And then there are some very interesting questions that we can ask when we examine this textual record at scale. So one of the most obvious things to ask about this particular newspaper data set, or corpus, you could call it, and it actually is something that can be asked at scale, is what these newspapers actually talked about. And were there meaningful differences, either thematically or statistically or both, with respect to the contents of the newspapers edited by and aimed at different audiences? And up here, you can see a recent essay in which I used topic modeling and then some measures from information theory in order to try to answer that question. But underneath the question of what these subgroups talked about is another and arguably more interesting question, which is about why it matters that we know what they talk about. And one of the reasons why it matters, and this is really the point of the project, is that editing these newspapers was really hard work. It was hard intellectual work, as anyone who has really edited anything knows well. And for women editors in particular, you can see two of them on the slide right here. It also involved hard emotional work. So these women editors were both expected to be more empathetic than their male counterparts. And then they were also attacked more for when they stood their ground on controversial issues. I just want to back up a little bit before I get into the results of this paper and underscore the point that the theoretical framework for understanding emotional labor, as well as the invisible labor of editing and invisible labor more generally, this framework is a feminist one. So there's this whole field of feminist labor studies, which draws from the original example of invisible labor, which is housework. So housework is invisible in two ways. For one, it takes place inside the home, so it's literally out of sight. But for another, it's also unpaid. And so it's also invisible to the marketplace. And because it's invisible to the marketplace, so, put more simply, it doesn't earn a person money, it's invisible in your bank account, it's also unvalued, at least within the context of a capitalist society in which monetary value indexes social or cultural value. So another word that's been used to describe this type of invisible labor is reproductive labor. And this word came about as a way of distinguishing it both from the productive labor of the marketplace and then what traditional accounts of labor call unproductive labor, meaning that these forms of labor did not produce anything that could be sold. But thinking about housework and related tasks like caring for children, thinking about them as reproductive labor, it becomes very clear that this labor is actually the very thing that allows the productive part of the economy to continue to thrive, right? And many of us, I should say, are experiencing a version of this right now with the absence of childcare, right? Like we cannot do our jobs that earn us money because there is no one else to perform the otherwise invisible labor of childcare. So just getting back to this paper, what I try to do is draw out the various dimensions of labor, both visible and invisible, that was expended by these two women editors. And more specifically, I use a measure called pointwise mutual information, or PMI, to identify the topics that were most uniquely significant to these two women editors. And I draw out the significance of each of these sets of topics for the abolitionist, I draw out the significance of each of these sets of topics for the abolitionist movement and for our need to analyze the burdens of labor intersectionally. That is, by considering how the larger structural forces of power exacted different costs from these two women, from Lydia Mariah Child, who was white, and then Marianne Shadd, who was Black. I dig a little deeper into questions about structural forces of power in this other project. This is a collaboration with Sandeep Soni, who's a newly minted PhD in interactive computing at Georgia Tech, and also Jacob Eisenstein, who's at Google right now. And here we take on a slightly different set of structural forces of power, which have to do with how the story of abolition tends to be told. So the standard account tends to credit white abolitionists for leading the charge to end slavery. And this is for a couple of reasons, and not the least of which is that white abolitionists had easier access to the world of print. More of them could write and read and had access to the printing technology and then to the money that enabled them to produce and distribute more newspapers. Whereas much of the Black organizing around this issue took place orally in these in-person organizing meetings known as the colored conventions. So there's actually a really interesting project, not my own, that has for a long time been working on excavating the evidence that documents these really important conventions. And one of the points that the colored conventions make, the Colored Conventions Project rather, and also other scholars, is that how the abolitionist movement took shape and gathered momentum, it wasn't quite as lopsided as it seems from our vantage in the present. One of the reasons for the view that we have today is that from the very beginning, white people were in charge of the institutions that preserved these newspapers. And so decisions about what was important and therefore what to keep for posterity, and then the opposite side of that coin, what was unimportant and therefore what to throw out. These were influenced, or you could say overdetermined, by questions of race and outright racism. And so this biased data set, because that's really what it is, has become the basis for contemporary historical scholarship on the subject, which has led until recently on more work being done on what is contained within the archive and less work being done on what is not. So in this project, what Sandeep, Jacob, and I try to do is provide another view into this unbalanced archive. So we ask, what if we look to linguistic innovation, which in some ways, not always, we can talk about that later, but in some ways is an index for ideological innovation, in order to see if there might be any additional stories that we can draw out from this corpus about the leadership dynamics of the abolitionist movement. And in order to do this, we develop a model of linguistic change and semantic change more specifically, as well as a measure of semantic leadership. And then we aggregate these semantic leadership scores into a weighted network in order to see which newspapers tended to lead in terms of linguistic innovation and which newspapers tended to follow. And then we present our findings, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes, as the basis for future humanistic research. Because the contributions of this paper are primarily methodological, and I think of interest to this particular course, I'll dig slightly deeper into each component of this paper. So the first is this model of semantic change, which expands upon the skipgram word embedding model. So the basic idea of a word embedding is to model the linguistic theory of distributional semantics. So this is the idea that the meaning of any particular word can be inferred by the context in which that word appears. So at the top left, you can see the basic word embedding model, in which the embeddings V and U are parameters in a model of the probability of each word token conditioned on its neighboring tokens. And what we do is modify this model so that it can take into account not only the context of the word, but also the time and the source in which that word appears. So then on the right, you can see what this gets us. This is the word justice, which is one of the words in our corpus that had one of the most visibly distinct changes in meaning over time and was also interesting ideologically. So if you look at its nearest neighbors in 1831, you see words like judges, trial, and offense. And this indicates this sort of narrow legal definition or usage for this term justice. But over time, and especially by the end of the corpus, you see its neighbors shift to reflect a more conceptual meaning. So words like liberty, citizenship, and universal. In this shift, it tracks qualitative arguments about how the idea of justice transformed into a much more capacious socio-political concept over the course of the 19th century. But then the question remains, and this is actually the more interesting question for our project, was there a particular newspaper source that was responsible for introducing this changed meaning? So, for a contemporary example, you could think of the idea of defunding the police, with this word defunding for a long time, just meaning like taking away money. But as a result of Black Lives Matter and prison abolition movements, it's come to carry more specific associations with the police, as well as I just mentioned, these connections to ideas of abolition. Abolition is this interesting keyword that qualitative work has shown that Black abolitionists actually were the ones to expand this idea of abolition from sort of simple and narrow legal definitions of the term to a much broader and aspirational sense of the term. In any case, this measure of semantic leadership, so how we figure out which newspaper was the source of the changed meaning and which newspaper was the next to adopt it, and this was actually developed by Sandeep for a previous paper. And I'm not going to get into the details of this, but the general idea is to compare the base embedding for the word to this residual embedding for each word in each source at each time period. And by looking at these, we can determine at what point a particular residual embedding takes over from the main embedding as the better predictor of how other sources will use that word. And then once we have these leader-follower pairs, so the newspaper that introduces the changed meaning and then the one that quickly adopts it, we can count them up and see a general picture. And so what we found in this analysis, or at least through this overall view, is a confirmation of some of the major qualitative work on the subject. For example, the National Anti-Slavery Standard. This is the paper edited by Lydia Mariah Child, who I talked about in the previous paper. This newspaper tends to follow or adopt changes much more than it innovates on new words. And this actually confirms its role as a moderate newspaper that was actually explicitly founded as a more centrist alternative to more radical titles. And then we can also do things like isolate the contributions of the Black press. So the diagram on the left shows a really nice encapsulation of the reach of the Black press into white edited newspapers, and really just how wide this reach was, contra the established view that the white abolitionists were the ones who led the charge. And then finally, since we have these nice leader-follower pairs, as well as counts of how many words characterize their relation, we can use this to induce a network. And so what you see here are the results of a network centrality analysis, which takes into account the distinction between leading and following in changes. So just so you understand the graph, so we use a particular method of analysis called HITS, because it decomposes centrality into what the people who describe this algorithm call authorities, but generally could be understood as people who tend to influence or lead in changes, and then hubs. And so these are the newspapers in our case that tend to aggregate the influences of others. And the image that you're looking at shows the hub score plotted against the authority score. So those that cluster at the top left tend to lead more than they follow. And those that cluster at the bottom right tend to follow more than they lead. Among the newspapers in our corpus, the two that lead the most compared to how much they follow are two newspapers edited by women. So the Provincial Freeman, this is the abolitionist paper edited by Marianne Shadd, who I mentioned again in my previous work. This was edited by Marianne Shadd, who was Black. It was known for its really hard-hitting editorial style, and it's a really nice confirmation of how radical it actually was, not only in terms of contents, in terms of the political stances that it took, but actually in terms of language. But then there's also another newspaper that shows up here, the Lily. This is a white women's suffrage paper. And this is actually a bit of a vexing result, knowing how white women suffragists were often quite racist. And when push came to shove, they chose their own enfranchisement rather than Black people's corporeal freedom. So what does it mean that many linguistic innovations in the abolitionist movement come from these white women writing about suffrage who may not have shared ultimately the same goals? You know, one of the things that I want to do as I begin to wrap up is bring this back to the point of departure for this talk about what feminist data science sort of can do and where it takes us. And what this result leads us back to is this idea of intersecting forces of power, which impact different groups in different ways and are expressed in different ways as well. And one of the things that I like about this paper is how it demonstrates how quantitative research can take on questions of structural power with respect to both gender and race, both as they operated in their own time, and then as they enter into the archival record, and therefore into our data sets today. And also how it really opens up the realm of qualitative research that might pick up these results and further probe what this relationship might tell us about the influence and the interrelation of the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement in terms of language, in terms of politics, you know, and not always in an unequivocal or unmitigated good way. So I'm going to stop there and just say thanks so much for listening. I'm really interested to hear what questions we end up discussing. I'll just say that there's a lot of different ways you can get in touch with me if you want more information either about this work or some of the other work that I do. I'm on the internet, I'm on Twitter, I'm on GitHub, and some other stuff that is not on this slide. But thank you so much for listening. And yeah, that is it.